Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk all about how Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Troy Brown Jr. will adequately replace Taurean Prince's production with the Timberwolves. We'll break down essentially each category of what they'll provide on the floor and why it's better than what TP did for the Wolves the last couple of years. Also, Kyle Anderson will be playing for Team China, and Jaylen Nowell, there is another team in the Western Conference very interested in signing the former Timberwolves guard in free agency. We're going to talk all about it on the show here today. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Happy Tuesday, everybody, and a big thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked on Sports Minnesota app, which you can download on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can find Locked on Wolves along with all other Locked on Minnesota podcasts over on that app. More great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. Again, download the Locked on Sports Minnesota app today on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked on T-Wolves and also at my account, which is at Beecken, and that's with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right. Today on the show, I want to spend quite a bit of time, in fact, most of the show here today, talking about Taurean Prince and how the Timberwolves will be replacing his production the last couple of years. And when you think of Taurean Prince, you think of, I think folks who didn't watch the Timberwolves closely, so potentially like Lakers fans who are preparing themselves to watch Taurean Prince this year, he kind of has this reputation as like a solid 3-and-D guy. And some of that is true, right? And that was kind of, remember when the Wolves acquired him when they traded Ricky Rubio a couple of summers ago? And I talked about on the show, I thought in a vacuum, Ricky Rubio was the better player at the time, but I thought Taurean Prince was the better fit for the Wolves. And I think pre-Rubio's latest ACL tear, that's probably still true. But because of Rubio's lack of shooting ability and they were effectively replacing him with Patrick Beverley later that offseason, I actually really liked ultimately what that ended up being, not to go too much in the Wayback Machine, was Prince and Jarrett Culver were out, and Juancho Hernan-Gomez, and then, Ricky Rubio, Jarrett Culver, and Juancho Hernan-Gomez were out. Taurean Prince and Patrick Beverley were in. And I thought that the combination of Prince and Beverley fit what the Wolves needed more, which was perimeter defense and perimeter shooting. And Rubio, Culver were not good perimeter shooters. Hernan-Gomez struggled in Minnesota as a perimeter shooter. And it just made a ton of sense. Taurean Prince didn't shoot the ball well in his first few months in Minnesota, but then basically the second half of his first season in Minnesota and last year, he was pretty much lights out. However, the defense began to decline. I thought that was fairly obvious, really over the course of his time in Minnesota. And at times he was pushed into doing a bit more in terms of, guarding like legit all-star caliber wings and guards at the point of attack last year. Like when there were games, especially, late in the year when Jaden McDaniels was hurt, earlier in the year when he was in a bunch of foul trouble, and we also had, Nickeil Alexander-Walker wasn't on the roster. You saw a lot of Taurean Prince kind of being that next man up because D'Angelo Russell couldn't do it. Jordan McLaughlin was hurt for a long time. Jaylen Nowell was a very poor defender. So Prince was kind of pushed into duty. And I talked a lot about Taurean Prince on Locked on Lakers. I think it was their Friday episode. I went on to talk about Prince. And I discussed how he is a really, really good, I would even argue to say great team defender still. And he's going to be, 29 this year, I believe. But I think the individual defense has legitimately taken a step back. I mean, the eye test would tell you that. All of the advanced metrics tell you that. I think I mentioned this on Locked on Wolves on Friday, is that Taurean Prince was dead last among qualifying small forwards last year at ESPN's defensive real plus minus, which that's one metric. But it's a pretty solid catch-all in not a great indicator. And most of the box numbers would say the same thing. Most of the box score plus minus numbers, not just ESPN's. So, and I think, again, the eye test, just by watching the Timberwolves last year, I thought it was pretty clear that there were some issues with Taurean Prince's defense. again, still a really good team defender and still a really good shooter. So over the course of preparing for the show to talk with the guys on Locked On Lakers on Friday, and then also I had them on Friday to talk about Troy Brown Jr. And I decided to dive a bit deeper into some of the numbers over at B-Ball Index, which, if you're not familiar, is it's a subscription site. It's like $5 a month or something, bball-index.com. They've become very popular on NBA Twitter. But if you subscribe to their site, you get access to all these different numbers on the back end. They have some proprietary stuff, but they do a really good job of aggregating essentially anything that's worth anything in the basketball world statistically, all these different metrics into one spot. So I took Taurean Prince and I compared him with both Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, because the way these roles are going to work for the Wolves, and we'll spend a lot more time talking about this as the offseason goes on, but basically the Wolves are taking Jaylen Nowell and Taurean Prince out of the rotation or off the roster. Jordan McLaughlin will probably be not in the regular rotation. So you're essentially replacing McLaughlin with, this is a little bit crude, but McLaughlin with Shake Milton, Jaylen Nowell with Troy Brown Jr., and Taurean Prince with Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Those roles won't be identical. I don't think Shake Milton's necessarily the quote-unquote backup point guard, but he'll function that way. Troy Brown Jr. is effectively Ant's backup at the 2, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker is effectively the backup at the 3. Those are basically interchangeable, right? And then you still have Kyle Anderson and Naz Reid, and I do think the way that the minutes will break out is you'll see a lot of Anderson at the 3 and you'll see a lot of Naz at the 4, just because of staggering Towns and Gobert's minutes. But essentially those are your next 5 up, right? Milton, Brown, Alexander-Walker, Anderson, and Naz. So you're replacing McLaughlin, Nowell, and Prince with Milton, Brown, and Alexander-Walker. For the most part, you're trying to replace what Taurean Prince's role in production was with Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. So we're going to talk about those two today. Obviously, Shake Milton plays some role in that, and his shooting, by the way, is the most key. Now, both Brown and Alexander-Walker have had good moments as shooters, and we're going to talk about that. But Milton is, somewhat ironically, those two actually shot the ball much better than Milton last year. But I think Milton, over the course of his career, has a much more encouraging track record as a shooter. And so the Timberwolves front office is surely assuming that Shake Milton's going to essentially, he's a much better shooter than Jordan McLaughlin. He's much better than what Jaylen Nowell was last year. And he should be the best shooter of the 3 between Brown, Alexander-Walker, and Milton. So we'll talk more about him another day. But today I want to focus on Brown and Nickeil Alexander-Walker and really just kind of straight compare them to Taurean Prince. That's what we're going to do for the bulk of the show. And trust me, I think you'll be a bit surprised at some of the categories in which either one of these guys are better than Taurean Prince. And again, it's the combination that are really going to be taking over what TP's role was. So I took all the main categories, and then I got a little bit more in the weeds on defense and shooting specifically, because I think that'll help us paint a really good picture. So we're going to do all of that here next, and that's what we'll spend most of today's show doing. A couple of notes at the end about Kyle Anderson, Jaylen Nowell. So we'll do that later as well. But let's again spend the bulk of it talking Prince versus Brown and Alexander-Walker. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at FanDuel. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think will be the first home run in any particular game. All of that is on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. MLB is fantastic to bet over there. You can go WNBA. The FIBA World Cup is upcoming. We're only a few weeks away from NFL training camp started this week, which is crazy. We're only a few weeks away from preseason NFL, and then not long after that, college football and NFL game action. So there's plenty to bet on over at FanDuel. But especially MLB right now. We're in the middle of the season, almost the dog days of summer. That's what you got to bet. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, every day as we're going to keep breaking down the rotation throughout this week. Again, a lot of time on Brown and Alexander-Walker today. We'll talk more about Shake Milton and what he'll replace from, I guess, really it's Jaylen Nowell and Jordan McLaughlin. So in a sense, I'm flipping this, right? We're talking today about replacing Prince with two guys. Tomorrow we'll talk about Shake Milton effectively replacing two guys in the rotation in McLaughlin and Nowell. Yes, I know Jordan McLaughlin's still on the roster, but I think he's probably your 11th or 12th guy. I don't think he's a primary backup going to play every night like he was going into last season. So we'll break that down on Wednesday's show. All right. So let's talk about these categories that I set aside here. First of all, Taurean Prince let's do this. Okay, let's go category by category. So just overall, one of the things that B-Ball Index does is they set aside key talent metric grades. There's 8 of these. They're at the top of every profile, and then they go much more in depth as you go down the profile. So of the big categories, we'll talk about those 8 to start, and then go deeper on 3-point shooting and perimeter defense. But of those main categories, 3-point shooting, Troy Brown Jr. actually had the best grade last year. Now, if you go back a couple seasons, that won't be the case. We talked on Friday with the Lakers guys, the Kamenetsky brothers, about how Troy Brown really surprised everybody with how well he shot the 3 last year. Based on all, like, just raw 3-point percentage, Taurean Prince edges out both Brown and Alexander Walker. But for the season, if you take all the different categories, not just raw 3-point shooting, B-Ball Index gives Troy Brown Jr. an A- grade last year specifically for 3-point shooting. Again, we don't know how fluky that was, and I'm only taking last season. But Brown was an A- in 3-point shooting. Both Taurean Prince and Nickeil Alexander Walker, which really surprised me, came through as B+. So I guess we'll do this. We'll spend a little more time on that right now. This was interesting to me for Alexander Walker. He was 38.4% overall from 3 last year, which is 79th percentile league wide. It's only, moderately lower. What was Taurean Prince? He was 39-ish, right? He was 38.1. So technically it was actually better than Taurean Prince. Overall, of the 3, Taurean Prince was the best catch and shoot guy last year. And going back a couple of seasons, that's also the case. He's also the best quarter 3-point shooter, which are kind of the first 2 things you often think of when you're like, okay, it's one of the reasons why I really like the Mike Conley acquisition. I said this at the time. Mike Conley was a better corner 3-point shooter and a better catch and shoot guy than D'Angelo Russell. So I liked his fit on the Wolves roster more than D'Angelo Russell, not just for those reasons, but it was one of the things I focused on the show. However, Troy Brown Jr. is a better above the break 3-point shooter than Taurean Prince. And so is Nickeil Alexander Walker. This shocked me. Nickeil Alexander Walker of the 3 was easily the best above the break 3-point shooter. I'm going to grab so above the break, Nickeil Alexander Walker shot 38.9%. Call it 39% above the break, which are obviously the longest 3-pointers you're going to shoot. That was 84th percentile, or an A- across the league. 39% above the break. That really surprised me for somebody whose shot mechanics are the least pretty of the 3, and at times really struggled to shoot the 3, not just with the Wolves, but throughout his career. Overall, last season above the break was 89th percentile league-wide, 39%. Troy Brown Jr. was 36.7% above the break, 74th percentile. And Taurean Prince was only 34.5% above the break. That's 62nd percentile league-wide. Taurean Prince was under 35% on non-corner 3-point attempts. That's significant. And I didn't realize that it was that big of a disparity. And more than half his 3-point attempts, 57% of Taurean Prince's 3-point attempts were above the break. They were non-corner 3s. He was only 34.5% on those non-corner 3s. That's a really important number, and something that I hadn't really noticed until I dug a bit deeper into these numbers. Troy Brown Jr. is also a marginally better pull-up shooter than Taurean Prince, as is Nickeil Alexander Walker. So those are the other 2 things that they're both better at. So Prince, far and away the best catch and shoot 3-point shooter and the best corner 3-point shooter of the 3. But both Brown and Alexander Walker are better on pull-ups and much better above the break. And Taurean Prince, pretty league average when it comes to above the break 3-point shooting, which again surprised me quite a bit. The next category is finishing. Nickeil Alexander Walker actually ranks, or I should say, was given a B+ by B-Ball Index for his finishing ability, finishing at the rim. Taurean Prince is a C-, and Troy Brown Jr. is an F. Troy Brown Jr. is more of a pull-up 3-point, as I mentioned a minute ago. He's a better pull-up 3-point shooter than Taurean Prince. That's what he's more likely to do in transition. In the half court, he's not going to get to the basket. Alexander Walker will. We saw that a little bit when he initiates in pick and roll. He's handling the ball. He's happy to get to the rim and try and score that way. And also in transition, Troy Brown Jr., that's not his game, and Taurean Prince was not very good at it last year, although he would try it a bit more than Troy Brown Jr. would in terms of overall attempts. Playmaking, pretty similar. Both Prince and Alexander Walker had B pluses in playmaking last year. Brown, a B. Sure, we'll see. We saw Prince initiate a bit of offense off the bench, and we'll see the same from Alexander Walker this year. I'm going to skip defense because I want to spend the most time on that. Offensive rebounding, Troy Brown Jr. a C+, Nickeil Alexander Walker a D, Taurean Prince an F. So another category where they're both better than Prince. Okay. Defensive rebounding, Brown and Prince both C+, Alexander Walker a D. Offensive impact, Nickeil Alexander Walker actually a C in both categories, Brown a D in both categories. Prince had a D- on offense and a D+ on defense, so we'll mostly ignore those because they're all pretty similar and none of them are really all that positive. So I want to focus in on the perimeter isolation defense. That, to me, is the most important thing here. We've already established that shooting, the Wolves, in theory, have a slight edge by replacing, and actually, if you factor in Nowell and McLaughlin, they have a huge improvement from outside the arc by replacing McLaughlin and his, I didn't even pull his number. Well, we'll talk about him when we talk about Shake Milton, but replacing McLaughlin, Nowell, and Prince with Brown, Alexander Walker, and Milton, a huge improvement. But even just these three we're talking about today, Brown and Alexander Walker, both equal or better than Prince in most three-point shooting metrics. Perimeter isolation defense, don't miss this. Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander Walker both received A grades, just a straight A from B-Ball Index for their perimeter isolation defense. A. Taurean Prince, a C+ last season in his perimeter isolation defense. I mean, it completely backs up what I had said previously about Alexander Walker and Troy Brown Jr. both being improvements. And this, by the way, the guys from Locked On Lakers were a bit skeptical about Alexander Walker being a better defender on the perimeter than Taurean Prince. But these numbers back it up 100%. And I want to go just a little bit deeper. So overall on-ball perimeter defense, Taurean Prince was a plus 0.03. The percentiles would be a lot easier to kind of unpack. 57th percentile as an on-ball perimeter defender. That's a C+. Troy Brown Jr., 90th percentile, grades out as an A. Alexander Walker, 94th percentile, also an A. So we could just leave it there. That's kind of the mic drop right there. Just overall on-ball perimeter defense. The value that these players provide. Alexander Walker, 94th percentile. Troy Brown, 90th percentile. Taurean Prince, 57th percentile. We could talk about, like, you just handpick any of these categories, really. Some of them are pretty similar, right? Like Taurean Prince actually created more turnovers than Troy Brown Jr. and actually more than Alexander Walker as well. But that's not the number one most important thing here, right? Passing lane defense. Taurean Prince had a C+ there. Brown was a C, so a little bit worse. But Alexander Walker is a B+. What does that mean? That's how active a defender is in passing lanes, according to B-Ball Index. Bad pass steals plus deflections per 75 possessions. Talk about contesting three-point shots. That's an area where all of them were similar, although Brown Jr. had an edge. Off-ball chaser defense, which is they don't actually have the full definition here, but I think that's basically when you're guarding a higher usage guy off the ball, how are you able to lock them down, or are you, I guess? Taurean Prince, 61st percentile. That's a B-. Alexander Walker, 89th percentile, A-. Troy Brown Jr., 92nd percentile. That's an A. Now, I have a couple more categories here I want to get to that I think are pretty interesting. But I think the picture here is pretty clear, right? Taurean Prince, of the three, was the worst perimeter defender this last season. I don't think there's any question about that. All right. Let's dig into a couple more of these subcategories, and then we'll close with the Kyle Anderson, Jaylen Nowell notes. So we'll do all that here next. All right, jumping back into the Taurean Prince versus Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander Walker conversation. Defensive miles traveled per 75 possessions, which isn't like this is one of those where I think it provides valuable context, even if it doesn't tell a whole story, right? So this is literally defensive miles traveled per 75 possessions. It's a second spectrum stat that B-Ball Index pulls. Taurean Prince was 25th percentile. 25th percentile last season. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, 72nd percentile in defensive miles traveled per 75 possessions. Troy Brown Jr., 81st percentile. Now, part of this could be Prince guarded a lot of point of attack, right? So if he's guarding the ball, he's not chasing somebody around screens in theory as much. Now, I don't know that this explains all of it, but it's logical to me. Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander-Walker may have been spending more time guarding off the ball last year than Taurean Prince. So I think that's worth noting. We could talk about matchup adjusted defensive feet per minutes played. Essentially, it answers the question, do they cover a lot of ground based on the matchups they've had? This attempts to explain away what I just tried to in layman's terms, just kind of looking at the stats. But if you go a step further, Taurean Prince was only 29th percentile in matchup adjusted defensive feet per minutes played. Alexander Walker, 68th percentile. Troy Brown Jr. also 68th percentile. Again, Taurean Prince, 29th percentile. So even adjusting for matchups, Brown and Alexander Walker were traveling far more miles, far more feet, however you want to break it down, whatever metric you want to use per possession, even adjusting for matchups versus Taurean Prince. You could also talk about ball screen navigation. Alexander Walker is phenomenal. We've talked before in the past how Jaden McDaniels was number one in the entire NBA when it comes to navigating ball screens, getting through them, success against ball handlers using screens. Alexander Walker also 97th percentile. That's an A+. Troy Brown Jr., 86th percentile. That's an A+. Taurean Prince, 45th percentile. That's a C-. So if you don't hear anything else from this episode, understand this. Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander-Walker had the same or better shot profile overall ratings based on B-Ball Index as Taurean Prince. And they are both far superior defenders, receiving overall A grades to Taurean Prince's C+ last season as perimeter defenders. The overall on-ball perimeter defense value, Taurean Prince was a C+. Both Alexander Walker and Troy Brown Jr. were A's. Defensive miles traveled, matchup adjusted defensive feet, Brown Jr. and Alexander Walker both blow Prince away. And ball screen navigation, Troy Brown Jr. an A-, Alexander Walker an A+, Taurean Prince a C-. Ball screen navigation, on-ball perimeter defense, miles traveled on defense, all, they're all related very closely, right? All far superior for the two new Wolves wings that will be effectively replacing Taurean Prince's minutes. Also add in the pull-up three-point shooting, and the other key subcategory was above the break shooting, both around 38-ish%. Taurean Prince was 34.5% above the break three-point shooting last season. Brown Jr. and yes, Nickeil Alexander-Walker should be better above the break based on what they did last year than Taurean Prince. All those things are very important. And wouldn't you rather have these two guys for effectively combined the same amount of salary? It's, within a few $100,000, combining Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. 1 year of Taurean Prince at over $9 million, or these two guys combined for $9-ish million, plus team options. Oh, actually, Alexander Walker is 2 years, but then a team option on Troy Brown Jr. for the year after. And then we could also talk about Shake Milton too, right? The more I look at this, the more impressed I am with what Tim Connolly did in replacing Prince's production and role with these two newcomers, semi-newcomer and Alexander Walker being re-signed, but also Troy Brown Jr. And what we'll do on Wednesday is kind of the same thing, but it's how Shake Milton replaces Jaylen Nowell and, to a lesser extent, Jordan McLaughlin in the Timberwolves rotation. So that'll be Wednesday's show. Closing out today, though, let's talk about Kyle Anderson officially going to Team China, officially being naturalized or becoming a naturalized Chinese citizen. So he'll be playing for Team China, and that's yet another Timberwolves player playing at FIBA. We'll have Rudy Gobert for France. We'll have potentially Karl-Anthony Towns for the Dominican Republic, although that's not official yet. Luka Garza is training with Team Bosnia, but may or may not actually play in the team. Nickeil Alexander-Walker playing for Team Canada, and now Kyle Anderson playing for Team China. I feel like maybe I missed somebody. There's like 5 Timberwolves that are playing in some way, shape, or form for FIBA World Cup, which is equal parts exciting and good for the player, good for Timberwolves international exposure. Will be fun to watch them play on an international stage, but also a little worrisome. Just obviously injury, and are these guys going to get worn down? I mean, games aren't for like another month, almost. So, and then they get back, and there's like a week to 10 days before training camp starts. So anyway, Kyle Anderson, though, playing for Team China. We'll obviously talk a lot about FIBA as we get into the end of August. We'll kind of visit in on how all these guys are playing, and I'll watch the games with all the Wolves players, and we'll talk about how they look and what their roles are with their respective international squads as we get into FIBA World Cup. The last thing will be Jaylen Nowell. We've said on the show for a long time that he will not be back with the Timberwolves as an unrestricted free agent. I think that was pretty clear from the beginning. He wants a role. The Timberwolves have already replaced his role. It wouldn't make sense to have a guy like that in the 15th spot on the bench at this point in his career for anybody. And he had a very poor season last year. I thought he was one of the worst, like night and day. I was so wrong about what he was going to do last year. 2 years ago, he was really good. Last year, he was really bad. He was one of the worst, like, rotation guys to continually receive heavy minutes of any playoff team. Of course, he had the knee injury that slowed him down at the end of the season, or also, I mean, it also kept him off the floor for long stretches. According to Darren Wolfson of Score North and KSTP in the Twin Cities, he says that the Dallas Mavericks have interest, and depending on what happens with Damian Lillard, he's on the radar of the Mavs. And he essentially could be a fallback option based on how the rest of the Dame market shakes out and everything else. So if that happens, it wouldn't surprise me if I ended up on Locked On Mavs to talk about Jaylen Nowell. And I will tell them just how great he was in 21-22. And I don't use, like, I'm serious when I say he was great. Like, he was legit 6-man type guy that year. And then last year when his role expanded, and the Wolves thought that too. They handed him that role. Chris Finch was talking about him as a member of the core in 22-23. And then he completely laid an egg last year. And I hope the best for Jaylen Nowell. I enjoy watching him as a player, and he seems to be a good dude. But he was not good last year. And we now know for sure, in case you weren't sure, because it was pretty clear from the start of the offseason he wasn't going to be back in Minnesota. But now we know that for sure, that Jaylen Nowell will be moving on, and the Dallas Mavericks apparently do have some interest in the former Wolves guard. All right. That's all I have for you today. And again, like Wednesday's show, and we're still daily here the rest of the week. We're going to talk a lot of Shake Milton this week. We're going to talk how the Wolves are backfilling the minutes vacated by the aforementioned Jaylen Nowell and Jordan McLaughlin, and also what McLaughlin's role might be this year with the Wolves. So all that's upcoming the rest of this week. And again, still daily through Friday. So be sure you're following and subscribed wherever you listen to podcasts. A big thank you to those that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, we're free and available everywhere, including YouTube. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, which you can download on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.